listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up, and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want to go to the ape believers saying, well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that.
And I look over my left shoulder, and this creature is running through the woods, and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host, Chuck, out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to everyone for listening and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. For those participating in the Sasquatch Syndicate monthly t-shirt giveaway, this month's winner was Neil Salter from Lincoln City, Oregon. So Neil, thanks for listening to the show, and please check your Facebook for winner notification. So on to this month's podcast. Tonight on Sasquatch Syndicate, we are joined by Human Nature podcast creator Micah Schweizer. Micah also appears on Wyoming's public radio and has been a great advocate for everything around nature and the outdoors, and really great to have him on the show tonight. So Micah, welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. Thanks for joining the show. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your podcast and where you're from.
So we're called Human Nature, and it's all one word smushed together with just one N in the middle. So Human Nature, sharing the N. And we have a website, humannaturepodcast.org. All the episodes are there, and we've got links to iTunes and Google Play and Radio Public and Stitcher and RSS, and I don't know what else, but we're on pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, you can find Human Nature. I think the trick is just to spell it correctly, or rather spell it incorrectly, as it were, Human Nature with just one N.
Micah, you had mentioned the Wyoming Sounds, and I thought maybe you might want to share a little bit about that station and really what goes on there.
Well, Wyoming Sounds is a 24/7 music station that we run. So Wyoming Public Radio has actually 4 different radio stations. So the one is sort of, you know, the kind what you normally associate with public radio, like Morning Edition in the morning, All Things Considered in the afternoon, that kind of stuff. And then Wyoming Sounds is a 24/7 AAA radio format. So we play, you know, a huge range of music from indie rock to folk to bluegrass to maybe a little bit of jazz to reggae to singer-songwriter stuff. So a huge gamut of music there, but sort of more popular music styles, and lots of new music. And then we have a 24/7 jazz service and a 24/7 classical service as well.
Awesome, and thanks for sharing that. So Micah, as we were kind of chatting earlier, and you know, both been on radio and public radio for some time, you know, here you are in a different genre. You're talking about, you know, human nature and the outdoors, and then somehow you cross into a encounter with John Meinzinski and the realm of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we're always looking for stories about human experiences in nature that are interesting or that somehow change our understanding of what nature is or what the human relationship to nature is. And of course, Sasquatch is perfect for that because it's in some sense this great unknown, right? I mean, you have some people who are absolutely convinced that Sasquatch exists, like John Meinzinski, who's the subject of the show. But there are lots of people out there who think that there's no way. And we wanted to see, or rather hear from somebody who's had firsthand experience. John had what he's quite convinced is an actual experience, an encounter with Sasquatch, and he's done lots and lots of interviews with other people who have had encounters with Sasquatch. And, he's a very credible source. He's trained as a scientist. He discounts stories from people that he does not find credible, so he's really filtering what he's discovering, and we thought he would just be a fascinating person and character to talk to, and in fact he was.
So Micah, maybe talk a little bit about kind of where you grew up and your connection to the state of Wyoming, and really, your connection to the outdoors, and really why that is so, awe-inspiring to you.
I've always had a strong affinity for nature and for animals. I think that changed a bit when I moved to Wyoming. So I've lived in a bunch of different places. Short answer is I grew up in Pennsylvania. Long answer is I spent my childhood in Switzerland, where I was born, and then moved to Pennsylvania later, and then bounced around various parts of the U.S. And about 5 years ago, I got the job at Wyoming Public Radio, and living in Wyoming is a fundamentally different experience than anywhere else I've lived, not just in the U.S., but internationally. I've never lived anywhere where the wild actually exists and is so close. I lived in southern Indiana for a while, and, you could make some sort of mistake and, get stuck in a cornfield or something and have an unpleasant night. But if you make an error in Wyoming, you could actually die. And there's something really visceral about that, and something really life-affirming about it. And I love being somewhere where nature is big, and you can drive through stretches of Wyoming and you feel like an ant on the landscape. And I think that's really healthy, because humans have taken over a lot of the world, and the world is becoming less wild, and we're forgetting that we're small and that we're just a part of the bigger picture. And I think in Wyoming, I'm reminded of that. And so that's one of the reasons I love living here.
So before we get into the replay and, of course, John's encounter, I wanted to do a little bit of trivia there on the state of Wyoming. And we had a lot of great reviews when we did the state of Alaska. And Micah was kind enough to talk through some of the trivia that he finds interesting about the state of Wyoming. So we thought we'd do that tonight as well. And so, Micah, maybe you can share a little bit about some of the more interesting trivia, since you moved out there from Indiana to the state of Wyoming, and some of the things you find fascinating. And I'll let you start.
Well, I think there are some. So, for instance, Wyoming has it has the lowest population of any state in the U.S., and I believe we have the second smallest population density. Honors go to Alaska for that, but Alaska, of course, is so huge, so that's why. Now, I have not confirmed this personally, but my understanding is that we have one escalator in the state of Wyoming, in a building, maybe a bank building or something like that, in Casper. And the tallest building in Wyoming, I'm told, is one of the dorms on the University of Wyoming campus, and I think it's 12 or 13 floors tall. So tallest in Wyoming, but it doesn't count as tall pretty much anywhere else.
Now, Micah, as you know, of course, we both got our starts in media in different places, and I was fortunate enough to work on Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom Productions. And one of the things I learned back when I was about 17 years old is the pronghorn in the state of Wyoming is one of the fastest animals in the Western Hemisphere. Had you heard that?
Yeah, so the pronghorn, which is often called an antelope, but it's technically not an antelope, it's just a pronghorn. It evolved to outrun, or at least try to outrun, the fastest land animal in the Western Hemisphere, which was some sort of a cheetah-type animal. And that animal did not make the evolutionary cut, but the pronghorn kept on, and so the pronghorn is now the fastest land animal in the Western Hemisphere.
All right, so being a Nebraska native, of course, I've got one trivia that I have to point out, and again, I know a lot of the listeners know I'm from Omaha.
My wife's from Wahoo.
I did not know that. And so, the Wyoming license plate, of course, Wyoming is adjacent to western Nebraska there, and the horse on the Wyoming license plate is a legendary rodeo cowboy, and I believe that they called him Old Steamboat.
Yes.
But the silhouette was actually a cowboy from the state of Nebraska. His name was Clayton Danks. So, of course, us Nebraskans would like to poke fun that the folks in Wyoming couldn't find their own cowboy. They had to come to Nebraska.
So we stole a Nebraskan for our license plate.
Yeah, well, that's what we like to say anyway. So before we get into the rebroadcast of the Human Nature podcast episode on Sasquatch and John Meinzinski's encounter, I thought we'd set the context. And the reason I wanted to bring Micah on the show and air this episode is, Micah's really not into the phenomenon and is really, as a result of this, kind of really starting to open his eyes on, what's really possible. And Micah, can you share a little bit about that experience? Because I think that there's a lot of listeners out there like yourself that are maybe not so much believers, but now are really more open to the phenomenon. And what's that journey been like for you?
So Sasquatch is the kind of thing that if you don't actually look into it, you just are sort of aware of it from like beef jerky advertisements and what was he in a Toyota commercial at some point? It's sort of this popular imagination thing, sounds like some sort of urban legend. And so I never really gave it a whole lot of thought for most of my life. But when we went and talked with John, what I really took to heart from hearing from him is the idea that if you're doing good science, you can't discount the existence of something. You don't necessarily have to wholeheartedly and enthusiastically think, yes, it's out there, but you have to at least be open to the possibility. And so after producing this episode and hearing from John, I probably fall, somewhere between agnostic and a believer. Like, I think it's possible. I don't know for sure if Sasquatch is wandering the Wind River Mountains, which is actually where John lives. He lives right in Sasquatch territory. But, I think, yeah, maybe. And I would love to learn more and find out if Sasquatch actually is out there. So I think I became open to it in a way that I'd never really thought about it a whole lot before. And so thinking about the possibility of Sasquatch and hearing somebody as thoughtful as John talk about Sasquatch, I think I can't discount the possibility anymore.
Awesome. And with that, we are going to rebroadcast, with Micah's permission, the Human Nature podcast with John Meinzinski. Please enjoy.
From Wyoming Public Media, this is Human Nature, real stories where humans and our habitat meet. I'm Caroline Ballard. On this episode, we'll hear about Bigfoot, or more precisely, Sasquatch. That's the Native American word, meaning wild man. To record this story, we traveled on dirt roads to the foot of Wyoming's Wind River Range, where Sasquatch is reported to live. It's also where John Meinzinski lives. In 1967, John was a college biology student. That's when a magazine article came out that everyone in his department started passing around.
It was on Sasquatch with photographs, stills from movie footage. The people involved in the sighting, the cameraman and the horsepacker who was with him, seemed to be credible. It was very interesting, but I can't say I believed in the subject at that time.
Like most biologists, John was skeptical about Sasquatch. After college, he got a job as a warden for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. He patrolled the back country on horseback for weeks at a time. Usually, the only people he ran into were sheep herders. They had their own Sasquatch legends.
Their term for it amongst all the sheep herders that worked in the Wind Rivers was the old man. And they had stories about them stealing sheep occasionally and running off with them and spooking the horses.
One night, John was camped out alone in the back country.
It was a forest camp, and something came by that was breathing at a very slow rate, and I thought it was a bear. That would be the obvious thing to think, because it came to a bacon stain I had in the tent. It was a Forest Service tent I got out of the warehouse, and somebody had spilled bacon grease all over the side of it. So I was sort of anticipating a bear problem. And the moon was coming up in the east. It was a wall tent, so it was tall, taller than I was. So it was over 6 foot too. And there was a really nice, perfect shadow of something coming into this bacon stain and poking its nose into it, probably licking it. I assumed it was a bear, and I had a .357 Magnum handgun with me. I had that out. So this thing was poking its nose in the side of my tent, and I hit it with the back of my hand and made a yelping sound. And it ran off, but it didn't go very far. It went about 20 feet, and I could hear it breathing in these pines, thick enough you don't walk through it comfortably, but it'd be a great place to hide. So this thing was in there and breathing, and then 40 minutes later or so it came back and did the same thing, and I hit it with my hand again, and it ran back, and for a half hour or 45 minutes I could still hear it breathing back there. Very resonant, deep breathing like an elk. I would say just imagine somebody snoring, very low-pitched snoring, both on the in-breathing and the out-breathing. I came back a third time, and this time this shadow, or the silhouette of it in the moonlight, which was almost a full moon that night, so it was a very good shadow. There was no wind blowing. It was standing up and was over the top of the tent and cast a shadow. Over it I could see an arm swinging, and it was walking on 2 legs. And then it stopped alongside of the tent, and there was an indentation in the wall of the tent, so I hit that indentation. And this time I hit something hard instead of something soft, so I'm pretty sure I hit a kneecap. And this hand came down over the top of the tent. So I saw the silhouette of a hand that was not the size of mine, but it had an opposed thumb like a human hand, not at all like a bear. And the hand was twice the width of mine with an open palm. It was well over a foot wide from little finger to thumb. And it was hairy. You could see the silhouette of hair between the fingers. Anyway, it fell over on the tent and had me pinned down by my legs. And then it got up and ran off behind those trees again. So now my tent was demolished, and I crawled out of it and built the fire that was in the fire ring in front of the tent. And just sat there and watched where the breathing was coming from, because I wanted to see what this was. And then I started to doze off. I woke up to the sound of something hitting the ground, and I looked up and didn't see anything. And then I saw a pine cone get lobbed from where the breathing was coming from in my direction. And in the next 3/4 of an hour, there were about 20 to 25 pine cones that got thrown at me. More correctly, I think they were being thrown at the campfire, because a lot of them landed in the fire and around it. And the whole time I could hear that breathing.
Eventually, the creature left. John couldn't hear it breathing anymore. In the morning, John looked for tracks, but the ground was thick with pine duff, and there were no tracks to be seen.
When it came down, I told my boss about it. He got up, closed the door to his office, and we had a private conversation, which basically was about other sightings that people have had in that area that summer. At that point, he suggested that although the Forest Service couldn't justify paying anybody to really investigate an animal that doesn't exist, there were reports coming into that office, and it made the newspapers nationwide at that time, 1972. The local ranger was getting requests from big game hunters who wanted to come out and find out the location of the last sighting so that they could collect the ultimate trophy. That put the ranger in a precarious position of, well, what if this is a guy in a monkey suit and he gets killed? The Forest Service is implicated in the murder because they told the person where to go hunt for it. So on that justification, I was asked to go and follow up on some of these sightings and get the full report and try to come up with physical evidence and find out if it's a guy in a monkey suit.
John spent the next year interviewing locals who said they'd seen Sasquatch. He also looked for physical evidence and finally found some. A hunter claimed to have shot a Sasquatch. Injured, it ran away.
It left some hair on the ground. I took it to the Game and Fish Department, who had a forensic veterinarian. All he could tell me officially was that the hair did not belong to a species native to Wyoming. But unofficially, he said, primate hair has a distinctive look to it, and this has that look.
The Game and Fish veterinarian recommended John take the hair to the University of Wyoming for a primatologist's opinion.
He said that he was not an expert in hair, but he would send it to the most notable expert in primate hair in the world, which was Walter Birkby. And he was a primatologist who was known for his expertise in primate hair identification. And, as George told me before he sent the sample off, should warn you that this man also has been outspoken on the subject of Bigfoot. And he would love to have any suspect hairs from a Bigfoot to be sent to him so he could disprove this myth. So he ended up with the hair, and his conclusion after looking at it was that it is definitely primate hair, and it's not human. It's also not from any known primate. So that's the reason I'm still interested. Most of the Game and Fish people I worked with my initial sighting were very interested in the subject and did follow up on it, but they did it very quietly and would deny any interest in the subject officially or publicly because it affects your job opportunities.
Why did you decide to be public about it?
Well, I think because I was young and ignorant when this happened. And I, in my naive state, thought that scientists would be interested in this, especially after the hair sample turned up to be an unknown species. This might be the most interesting wildlife project to come along. But it turned out it's not that way. I was threatened with my job by a higher up in the Game and Fish Department, as was the head veterinarian for Game and Fish at that time, and another person who expressed interest in it, who I won't name. We were threatened with our jobs if our names were ever even connected with the word Bigfoot in the future. The other people I know that were interested in this subject never talked about it again openly. But I made the decision that I could never work for the Game and Fish Department because of that.
John kept following up on reported sightings. As he asked people about their experiences, he found many were reluctant to share their stories. But some people were willing to talk. One woman's story stuck with John ever since.
She's a musician and would learn her repertoire in the mountains by going hiking. And she was on one of her summer hiking tours of Colorado wilderness, where she stayed out for a month at a time and just camp and practice her flute. And one time she was practicing in a tent and thought she heard a stick break behind her tent, so she got her pepper spray out, thinking it was possibly a bear, crawled out in front of her tent and had to look over the top of her tent to see what it was behind it. And she was face to face with a very large, hairy, human-like face, which she described as a human face, but with a body that was completely covered in hair, except for the circle around the eyes, nose, and mouth. It was about between 7.5 and 8 feet tall. It had a very compassionate look on its face, so she said it was a confusing time for her. She was not necessarily afraid as much as awestruck by the sight of something that human-like and that large. And she feels it was drawn in by her music. She had a very close and good sighting, 12 feet away, and it lasted a long time. She thought close to a minute, where they just stared at each other, which is a very long time for Sasquatch sighting. And then it turned around, and she said when it turned around, she realized it was not human, at least not the way we define human. turned around very gracefully for something that weighed close to 1,000 pounds. And it was so graceful in its movement, she knew that a human couldn't move that way. And then when it moved aside, another one was behind it, which was smaller, and she took to be the mate, the female. And it stared at her for a long time, too. And then it wheeled around also gracefully, and they both walked to the edge of the meadow and stood next to each other, looked back at her. And she couldn't move, she said, for quite a few minutes after that, because she just didn't know what happened to her. So she was walking back and forth, pondering this whole experience. And she had picked up a branch off of a spruce tree and was just kind of working it with her fingers as something to do while she was concerned about this sighting and what it meant.
The musician fiddled with the branch for a while. It was unique, with 2 smaller branches coming off the main stem. Then she set it down. It was time to leave anyway, so she packed up her camp and spent the day hiking back to her car. She arrived late, so she spent the night near a picnic table.
And then in the morning she got up, and on a boulder next to the picnic table was this same branch she had been twirling around.
Listening to people's stories and reading more about Sasquatch, John found that the stories had patterns, leaving tokens, like the spruce branch was one. Sasquatch apparently likes to do that. But another pattern emerged. Some stories told of Sasquatch capturing humans and keeping them. There's a report of this happening to a man in British Columbia.
So he lived with a family of Sasquatch in British Columbia for about a week.
As a pet?
As a pet. The children played with him, the young Sasquatches. Fascinating story.
The multiple sightings and reports, the scientific and cultural ridicule, none of this is new historically. John points out several animals have been sneered at before being accepted by science. One is the okapi, an African creature that looks like a cross between a giraffe and a zebra. It's rare, but it does exist.
Another animal is the gorilla. It was not accepted. Several hundred years went by where people described seeing gorillas and drew pictures of them. And the Royal Academy in England just didn't accept it and ridiculed people who went down looking for an ape, basically. But it was described as an animal with a human face. And there were lots of paranormal associated stories to go along with it. That these things could get into your dreams, and they could control your mind, and they were part man and part beast. And now we know and accept that lowland gorillas and mountain gorillas exist. The paranormal aspects have gone away, but people were afraid of even looking for these things. It's only a matter of time before Sasquatch is discovered in the same sort of way that the gorillas were. So what do you do with that? You just say, I'm not going to believe in it, we'll put those in a drawer and never look at them again. Or, I believe, if you're a true scientist, you open the drawer and you start investigating.
What is it about Sasquatch that captures people and captures maybe their imagination?
Well, I think many of us are fascinated with the unknown. And this is one of those subjects which is almost entirely unknown, except for stories, anecdotal stories, dating back, I might add, thousands and thousands of years amongst the Native Americans.
How can there be such a big species, 7 feet tall, that's still undiscovered in 2016?
Well, that's one of the mysteries. Hard one to answer. We can make guesses. The most common guess the anthropologists give is that we're dealing with an intelligent being that's probably very human-like and more skilled at evading its enemies than we are, because it actually lives in the woods. That's one answer. And number 2 answer probably has to go with it, is that we're dealing with a very low population size. So what if there are only 5 in the Wind River Range, but they happen to be intelligent and very skilled at avoiding their enemies? The number one enemy would probably be human beings or maybe grizzlies. I think there's this fear that there's something there that we can't ever really completely know, kind of like a ghost. I think people poo-poo ghost stories, unless they've seen one, commonly because they're human, but they're not tangible. You can't really grasp it, or you can't understand it completely. And for some reason, that makes people fearful. I think approaching it, though, as a scientist, you see it differently as, everything in science starts out that way. You don't have to fear it. It starts out as an unknown, and then you systematically look for more information until you can document it and understand it. The fact that this particular species resembles a human, and we haven't identified it yet, makes people anxious. And I'm not sure why.
And you'd like to maybe be captured by one?
Well, in a friendly way, yeah. I've lived in the woods enough. I have maybe a little overconfident that I could eventually escape. Maybe not, but I would rather do that and document it than fire a gun at one.
Our storyteller was John Mydzinski. If you enjoyed the episode, you can help other people find the show too by giving us a rating on iTunes, leaving a comment, or sharing it with your friends. I'm Caroline Ballard. The show's producers are Aaron Jones, Anna Rader, and Micah Schweizer. The theme song is by Caught a Ghost. Human Nature is a production of Wyoming Public Media.
It's human nature.
So there you have it from the Human Nature podcast. Again, thank you, Micah, for coming on Sasquatch Syndicate. We really do appreciate it. And again, you can find additional episodes at humannaturepodcast.org. So once again, Micah, thanks again for reaching out, helping to promote our cause. And as a community, we're always better together. I really do appreciate it, and I know our listeners do as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck.
Have a good day.
Good to talk to you. Yep, bye-bye.
This concludes our August 2018 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Saturday, September 1st. Thanks to all our listeners and those who have been out to our website and those who have joined us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject, so for all the believers and disbelievers and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.